Greetings, me hearties. It's me, the bald-headed bastard of the briny seas himself, Captain Adam. Welcome aboard the VHS Pirate Ship. And today, we're pulling up anchor and heading to port. The port of pro wrestling tapes. So get in the ring, mateys, because today we're talking about pro wrestling. Yarr.
Pro wrestling. A sport where men with no pants fight over a belt. It's tremendous, it's action, it's drama, it's intrigue, and it's performance art. And I've been a fan since I was a little pirate, which was a long time ago. And let's go even farther back than that and start at the beginning of pro wrestling's history. It's said to have started back in the 1860s, wherein it was mainly a circus act, and you could watch them at a sideshow, where you could wrestle a fucking bear. As it went on way into the 1900s, its popularity gained momentum, and different leagues and territories started forming. And with the advent of television, that momentum went into overdrive. And then, with the birth of home video, in the late 70s and 80s, it blew through the roof. Yes, the 80s. This is when pro wrestling truly became a global phenomenon, due in large part to what was then known as the World Wrestling Federation. And that is why the 80s and wrestling go together like peanut butter and jelly. And since the 80s and VHS also go together like peanut butter and jelly, if you put them all together, you get some kind of peanut butter and jelly mega sandwich. And the black lion of this proverbial mega sandwich Voltron would have to be Coliseum Home Video, which was the video arm of the WWF. But it wasn't only them that brought pro wrestling into video stores. There were a number of other distributors that brought the more unknown into your home. So lace up your boots and get in the ring, because coming down the aisle is today's episode, and we're pulling into the port of pro wrestling tapes. As the WWF began pushing pro wrestling into the forefront of pop culture, Coliseum Home Video quickly became the name of the game, as they dominated video store shelves. But other distributors were riding the wrestling tape wave with non-WWF features. These weren't widely known, as they often featured matches from wrestlers only really known from certain territories, in which they were a hit, but nationally, not so much. So these tapes didn't get the grand distribution that most did. After all, it is all about marketing, and the WWF had the idea to market towards kids. And the other promotions didn't really give a fuck about that. I mean, could you imagine Bruiser Brody in a cartoon? They were still making money, so why change the formula? But as the WWF started acquiring territories and the wrestlers that made them popular, the writing was on the wall and the curtain was soon shut. And as the latter part of this power struggle ensued, the AWA, which had yet to be acquired by the WWF, had their own line of tapes, which weren't very widely distributed, but you could find them on some video store shelves. But it would be the other video stores. And by 1991, the AWA would go on to be completely bought out by the WWF. And since their video collection had limited distribution and limited runs, the AWA videotape collection can be rather hard to find these days. And as the WWF was gathering up promotions like eggs on Easter, there was one promotion that stood firm against him, and that was known as the Jim Crockett promotion. which was an affiliate of the National Wrestling Alliance, and later would become known as World Championship Wrestling. And in 1988 was sold to the Turner Broadcast System. And now that WCW was owned by the Turner Entertainment Group, it would become a powerhouse. And they released tapes upon tapes of their own material to compete with Coliseum Home Video. And though these had a wider distribution than the AWA tape collection, it still was the Coliseum Home Videos that seemed to dominate video store shelves. However, the WCW tapes could be found tucked in amongst them, but it was very hard to compete against Coliseum Home Video, from the production quality to the high distribution to the layout of the boxes, to the fact that these tapes weren't only just pay-per-view events, they were also events that you really couldn't see anywhere else, like matches that took place overseas, like in the UK or Japan, that were normally released on their WrestleFest or Super Tape collections. But those you may already know about. And then there exist the weird, wild, and wonderful things of the wide world of professional wrestling tapes. Captain Adam's VHS Pirate Ship will be right back after these messages. Yee-haw! Come on down to Cowboy Pork Chop's Choke and Puke Family Restaurants. Never mind the lawsuits. Come on down and rush you up some grub. Get our world-famous fried fart basket, only $5. Or get yourself an armpit and cheese submarine sandwich, only $5. Or our homemade booger loaf platter, only $5. And now get a free Captain Adam toy with every Buckaroo Kids meal. So come on down to Cowboy Pork Chop's Choke and Puke Family Restaurants, right on the corner of Route 25 and Get a Whiff Boulevard, right beside Bill's Dirty Mattress Outlet. Yee-haw! Cowboy Pork Chop not responsible for death or illness. We now return you to Captain Adam's VHS Pirate Ship. The ports of pro wrestling tapes is an expansive and wondrous place, with all sorts of interesting things to see. And lots of this stuff we were introduced to as kids on the video store shelves, wherein you would have your WWF and WCW material, but then there would be these strange things that you weren't really sure what they were. You knew it was wrestling, but what kind? Where's it from? What the hell is it? By this time, we were used to seeing the Coliseum Home Video or the Turner Entertainment videos they put out, but this stuff would seemingly have no place. They were enigmas that forced my little world to expand, and part of that expansion was realizing that just because I was a fan did not mean I knew shit about wrestling. Let's take the Dusty Woods Entertainment home videos, for example. And though they highlighted wrestling features, they also made pseudo-stag films, which makes sense because dudes like wrestling. And then you would have the Pro Wrestling Illustrated home videos, which was and still is a magazine that features, you guessed it, pro wrestling. And these videos were featurettes and highlight reels of the stuff they found most impressive. And there was a lot of third-party stuff that would say they're not affiliated with any federation. So what the hell am I watching? And then there was stuff like this. I'm not entirely sure what this is, so let's just move on, shall we? Like I mentioned earlier, all this stuff would force our little worlds to expand. And another part of that expansion was realizing that there was more to it than just the big two. It was then that we would start hearing about ECW, which was established in 1992 out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, but didn't really get a national spotlight for a while. But it certainly got lots of regional attention, and those of us on the East Coast certainly knew what it was. As it was an East Coast promotion, the original moniker was Eastern Championship Wrestling. It was then changed to Extreme Championship Wrestling. And though our local television market never picked up its programming, I certainly knew all about it through wrestling magazines. And every now and again, you would find one of these babies in your local video store shelf, which was a treat because being that it didn't have a national distribution, they were actually really hard to find, and they still kind of are today. And speaking of hard to find, let's talk about Japanese wrestling tapes. Holy shit, you thought pro wrestling was big here in the States. Who lordy, it is huge in Japan. And they certainly had the tapes to prove it. And they also had, and still have, their own big two, with New Japan Pro Wrestling and All Japan Pro Wrestling, which were both established in 1972. And our big two here in the States had cross promotions with them, which there were tapes of as well, and those were a little easier to find here in the States for obvious reasons. But finding the New Japan Pro Wrestling and the All Japan Pro Wrestling tapes in the 80s and early 90s was a Herculean task. And to find them, you often had to rely on the tape traders, which is something I'll get into here in a second. Before the days of the internet, you really could only see Japanese wrestling through VHS tapes, or you could read about them in the wrestling magazines, in which you might find a mail-away offer for highlight reel tapes. But to watch any event or television programming, you had to get a hold of the actual tapes. And you can find this stuff a little easier today, but you're going to pay big bucks for it. But back then, the options were few, and it all depended on who you knew. Enter the tape traders. And I really can't have a show about pro wrestling VHS tapes without talking about tape trading. And that is an expansive thing all in itself. This goes back through the 80s, where before the big two were established, they were still the many different territories and promotions throughout the country. And pretty much all of these different promotions had their own television time slots, but usually only the regional markets would carry them. And these were the days before cable as we know it, and you only could watch what your local television market had in its programming. Meaning, for example, if you lived in Montana and wanted to watch Mid-South Wrestling, you couldn't. But if you knew someone in Arkansas, you would start a correspondence with them, they would tape the program for you and mail it to you, and you would do the same for the territory you were in. And thus began pro wrestling tape trading, and soon wrestling fans in all the territories would start doing this, and it would even branch over to the Japan territories, and down in Mexico for the Lucha Libre territories. This was a huge deal. This stuff was as rare as it gets back then. The whole thing became its own counterculture. And though the practice has become obsolete, so to speak, there are still many blogs and vlogs and podcasts solely about the culture of pro wrestling tape trading. Captain Adam's VHS Pirate Ship will return after these messages. It's Fat Boy Surplus. Fat Boy Surplus. Closeout irregular husky boys clothing outfitters, specializing in all the things nobody else wanted. Come on in and get mega deals. Mega deals on irregular clothing to fit your chunky little lad. Your kid's fat. This Saturday, get 3-sleeved cartoon cat t-shirts, only $5. $5 Or get uneven-legged, itchy, scratchy jeans in huskies and cadets. They'll hate them. Fat Boy Surplus. Fat Boy Surplus. And this week only, get a 3-pack of fat socks. 2 for $5. Or 5 for 2. Your choice. And as always, there's free balloons and chicken wings for your fat-ass little kid. So come on down for mega deals. Mega deals. At Fat Boy Surplus. Fat Boy Surplus. Close out irregular husky boys clothing outfitters. We now return to Captain Adam's VHS Pirate Ship. Man, it feels like I've been talking an awful long time about this, and I barely scraped the surface. See, this is a show about VHS tapes, not pro wrestling, but you really can't talk about pro wrestling tapes without talking about pro wrestling. And the whole subject matter is such an expansive thing. Pro wrestling has been, and still is, a huge world. And the VHS tapes it spawned is no exception to that rule. There's so many moving parts here, and I'm really trying my best to slim it down and sum it all up. And wrestling is a wide world, and I simply can't talk about wrestling without talking about the luchadors. And probably you're just like me, and your interest and fascination and knowledge of luchadors began with WCW's Monday Nitro. Now, and I'm speaking for myself here, but once again, I'm reminded that I might be a fan, but I don't know shit about wrestling. Luchador wrestling is an entirely different thing than wrestling as we know it. And it all comes down to the mask that they're so famous for. That is where a luchador's power lies. And just like Samson's hair, if it's removed, there goes their power. And honor and career, hell, it's just a big fucking deal. And speaking of big fucking deals, you can't talk about luchadors without talking about El Santo and the Blue Demon. Through the 1950s and 60s, these guys were huge. And it goes even further than that. You can say they're immortal. They were so popular that these guys broke out of the ring and onto the big screen, wherein their characters were the subject of many films, including one where they pretty much just fight all the fucking monsters. This stuff is great, and if you can find any of the VHS tapes, it'll look great on your shelf, especially if you collect pro wrestling tapes. This stuff makes a fine addition to any pro wrestling tape collection. And I know when you hear Santo, you probably think of what that sleazy agent kept calling Santa Claus in Ernest Saves Christmas. Bet you didn't think I can link those two together. Where was I going with this? Ah yes, El Santo. And El Santo was the subject of a comic book which ran up until 1987, which goes to show you, when people love wrestling, they really love wrestling. These guys were heroes, and they showed you what a villain was. They really gave you a moral compass. And the world of professional wrestling is wide indeed. But professional wrestling fans, well, that's just a huge world altogether. And if you're also a fan and plan on getting into pro wrestling tape collecting, just be prepared. It's a wide world where some of it's easy to find, some of it's not. Some of it's relatively cheap, and some of it's really fucking expensive. So just know what you're getting in for, and enjoy your collection. Just like I hope you enjoyed this show. But for now, I gotta slap a bow on this bad boy, because we're desperately out of time. And I'll see you all next week, folks, on Captain Adam's VHS Pirate Ship.